Kim Lemme. I am the executive director of DigDeep Labs, which is our research, innovation, and data arm of DigDeep. So we work across all of the organization, working with our colleagues on project sites, our colleagues, who do all of our project work, our policy friends, and today we are here to talk through the economic impact of allowing this WASH crisis to continue and the economic benefit of ending it. George, I'm going to hand it over to you for intros.
Yes, and I'm George McGraw. I'm the founder and CEO at DigDeep. And I know many of you already, which is so nice. And forgive us for using these microphones, but I was told I had to. I think, to put a larger perspective on the discussion we're going to have today around economics, we're also going to talk from the lab's perspective about conducting community-based research and what we can do as a sector to kind of close some of the gaps in data in a really calculated way that we know is going to move a conversation forward, achieve a policy objective, serve a community in a very specific way, and kind of give you a little bit of the inside baseball. We're going to give you the sort of baseball game itself, like what is this report, what does it say, what are the economics here, really kind of dive into that a little bit, and then we'll do a little bit of the inside baseball. So why this report, why then, what does it mean, what does that mean for other research projects that we might want to do across the sector, and discuss together some of the problems that your organizations are seeing, some of the solutions you're seeing, and how you might want to measure those too, and how we can put together projects that can help each other do that. Sound
Great.
good?
Yes.
And we're going to do this like a fireside chat, think sort of, 1940s presidential vibes.
Mm-hmm. You're the president, right?
Well, yes.
Of course.
I'm the president. First gay one. Which isn't that exciting anymore, unfortunately. Yeah, we'll do it that way.
Great. So this report, we had some copies. They went quickly. So I was hoping to have some here at this session, and they disappeared because we do have more hard copies. So if you really want a hard copy, I'm happy to send you one, and it's also available online. So you can go to our website. I can give you the exact link, but you can also go to our website and find it. But a couple of years ago, DigDeep published this groundbreaking research on the economic impact. It followed in the footsteps of the Closing the Water Access Gap that we published with the U.S. Water Alliance, and this was a next natural step of, well, what's the impact of this? It's not who's impacted, but it's what's the impact on all of us, and what's the economic considerations. So can you tell this group a little bit about the report and why DigDeep chose that as the step after Closing the Water Access Gap?
Yeah, absolutely. So this report is called Draining. It's the first ever look at the economic impact of the water access gap on the U.S. economy. And we'll talk a little bit about this later, but the reason for this report was twofold. One, because when we were doing our first ever report on this issue that I co-authored with Radhika Fox, who recently left EPA as the Assistant Administrator for Water, we were doing this Closing the Water Access Gap report, and we were trying to quantify, like, how many people in the U.S. don't have access to water? Why don't they have it? Why is that gap persisting? And we would visit families and see their sort of lived reality. This was primary sociological research under, for those of you that are familiar, an IRB. And so we were in people's homes kind of talking to them about their everyday experience in 5 different regions of the U.S. that were experiencing particularly acute lack of access to water and sanitation. And what we consistently heard from people was, this impacts my family's sort of economic reality. This is the biggest existential threat to my family every day is our ability to kind of put food on the table, buy medicine, whatever. And this lack of access to water is, not only making life stressful and in a certain way miserable, but also like the thing that I get up in fear every morning is not like, will I be able to find water today, but like, will I be able to afford to live? And at the time we couldn't quantify that. We couldn't put a dollar amount on that, but Radhika Fox, God bless her, a very smart woman, turned to me and she said, if we can make that argument, if we can find that number, lawmakers will care. And they'll care in a very different way than they do now, when all we're doing is sort of telling them a story. Stories are really powerful, especially like the panelists said, stories that come from communities, are led by community members and told by community members themselves, stories that show what's possible. But for a very specific audience, lawmakers, especially on both sides of the aisle, they want to know that dollar amount. And so that's how this report came to be. That answers your first question, right?
It absolutely does. And I think, as many of us know in this room, this is an issue that, one of the few issues remaining that doesn't have to be partisan. And so sharing information in multiple different ways with different facts behind it resonates differently. And so this is a strong argument. So what is the impact of the water access gap on the U.S. economy?
Well, the headline is on the screen. It's that every year we allow the gap to stay open, the U.S. economy loses about $9 billion, and I'll go into what that is. Now, I think the thing to know about this is that the water access gap, as we currently understand it, is at least 2.2 million people. We think that's like a vast undercount because we're using census estimates from a census product called the American Community Survey that is proven scientifically to be inaccurate at penetrating and specifically undercounts in marginalized communities. And almost all the communities we're talking about are these communities, are rural communities of color, low income, not high access to broadband. They're difficult to penetrate with census workers. And those numbers, which work on 5-year estimates, they're really not designed to help tell us how many people don't have access to water and sanitation. We stopped doing that in the 90s when we took those questions out of the long form of the census. They're really designed to tell lawmakers and policymakers what the housing stock of the US looks like. And the reason we have them is for economic purposes. Like, we're trying to track the creation and growth of wealth and economic prosperity in the country. And one indicator for that is how many houses are there, how many of them are occupied, and what facilities do they have? That tells us a lot about the sort of baseline in a community, but it doesn't tell us a lot of specifics. One really important thing, if you go to the next slide, to know about this report is that it doesn't include even all those 2.2 million Americans. It's a much more conservative estimate. There's two reasons for that. There's sort of the practical reason, and I apologize for all the words on this slide. There's the practical reason for that, which is that there is better data for people in housing than out of housing. So this data set did not include folks experiencing homelessness. The other reason for that is that we know that lawmakers are going to look at this data, and if we want them to create legislation from it, they're going to independently score it. They're probably going to take that and they're going to run it through the Congressional Budget Office, or they're going to run it through a Congressional Research Service in the Library of Congress, and they're going to ask congressional researchers, can you validate this research? And so anytime you're putting a piece of research in front of a lawmaker, you want it to be as conservative as possible so that it's much harder for them to poke holes in. This is like that inside baseball stuff I was talking about. So this data set is really like a desk research project for existing literature, like a lit review, and it just includes a sample of about 1.57 million people. And it takes that population, it looks at what their sort of everyday experience is like, and it assigns values, economic values, to the coping mechanisms that those families are presumed to have to go through on a daily basis in order to get access to water and wastewater. And it uses both national and international literature to do this. There's actually way better research on the impact of a lack of access to water, sanitation, and hygiene globally than there is in the US. I mean, surprise, surprise. One of the reasons, by the way, that research exists globally and doesn't exist in the US is because globally there's a much better organized WASH sector that has been collecting that data together and pushing that research forward. And until this week, we haven't had a concerted effort, toward that in the United States. So this is a big step forward.
And it's all linked, right? I mean, the reason we're here this week is to create this space, to create the sector, to create the conversations and the connections. So that's amazing. I'm going to skip the next question because I think you've answered it for the most part.
I'm all over the place.
No, it's great. It's great. And this is really a free-flowing conversation. So once we get through kind of the fireside chat, we would love to hear from you and hear what people are seeing in communities, in your work, in your research. So what is the impact on families look like on the ground? What did the research say? And how did you kind of get into what those stories look like?
I think that I was trying to think about how to answer this question. I think I'll start by saying that one of the benefits of being we're not a research organization. In fact, Kim, who is a very accomplished leader of research and M&E and all the work that we do at DigDeep through DigDeep Labs, she wasn't even on the team when we did this.
This predates me.
Yes, and my background is in law, so I'm leading this project, and I don't know what the hell I'm doing. But I think one of the benefits about being an implementing organization that decides to take up a research project, and by the way, we did that by pulling in really brilliant partners from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, from IAPMO, and from this research think tank out of Michigan called Alterum. And they're the ones that did all the sort of baseline sociological and economic research on lead line replacement. Basically, like, what we knew that there were research models we could copy, and we knew one that was particularly effective was lead line replacement. They were able to look at, like, okay, what is the impact that lead's having on educational outcomes, on health outcomes in some of these impacted communities, and they built this economic model. So we went to that think tank, and we said, we want you to do this primary research, we want Robert Wood Johnson to fund it, and then we'll sort of lead it to make sure that it works for lawmakers and for the public. But as an implementing organization, we were also able to put a face on it. And so often that's what research lacks. It lacks a storytelling element that makes it sort of accessible. And I don't mean broad accessibility. This report did that, but even accessible to the audience you really want to consume it. I mean, I've worked in a congressional office. I know that a member of Congress may or may not be very intelligent, period, may or may not be very intelligent about a specific thing, and they, probably, economics might not be at the top of that list. It might be something, a different kind of intelligence, like community organizing, or like a specific branch of policy around transportation or energy, and they may or may not have someone in their office with an economics background at all on their LA or LD staff. And so I think there is a lot that our sector or sectors like us are delivering to audiences, thinking that they're going to respect something that's really, hardcore academic, it's black and white, it's Times New Roman, assuming that they're going to have someone who can digest that for them, and that's not always the case. So knowing that, we decided to make something that you could digest with a 5th grade reading level, so everybody could read it and digest it, which involved extra steps, taking the academic research and really simplifying it through about 4 rounds of rewrites. And then also, and most importantly, grounding it in storytelling. So we went out to our field staff and said, okay, here's the preliminary research. Like, we're seeing all of these different economic impacts related to these coping strategies, which we'll talk about in a second. Where are you seeing that in real life in the field, and can we meet some of those families and talk to them? And so this was one of the families featured in the report. The woman, let's see, on the far right of the left-hand picture is Brenda Johnson, and she is Navajo Diné from a place called Smith Lake, New Mexico. And I visited Brenda's family on the back of a water truck that we were, using to deliver water before they got a home water system, before they got an off-grid running water system. And when we got there, sort of everyone flooded out of the house, as is so often the case, to fill anything that they could with water, which is what's happening on that right-hand picture. I mean, cups and mugs and buckets and barrels and pickle jars and truly anything that could be cleaned and hold a drop of water. We filled and brought all of this into the house and placed it on every surface. But Brenda kind of ran out from the kitchen with a pot, and she filled it directly from the truck, and she went back to the kitchen. So I followed her back there to sort of start an interview, talk to her a little bit, and she was like, okay, I'll talk to you, but I'm cooking tamales and you have to help. And so I started sort of mixing masa, and I was like, well, this is so nice. Are you having family over? Are we having a party? What's happening? And she looked at me very seriously and said, no, this is a source of income for me. I'm going to make these tamales. I'm going to put them in this cooler. I'm going to walk down the hill. I'm going to put on my food seller's license, and I'm going to sell these tamales. This is how my family gets gas money. She also worked down the hill at a local Blimpie. And she explained to me that her husband, who was the primary breadwinner of the household, he worked at a trash sorting factory 50 miles away. and something had fallen on his foot. He'd been injured, had come home and couldn't care for the wound because the house didn't have running water. And so it became infected. He got gangrene, and eventually had to be life flighted to a hospital in Gallup, about 50 miles away. And I was like, well, okay, that's really intense. How's he doing? And she's like, oh, he's fine. He got released from the hospital 10 days ago. And I was like, oh, well, that's so great. And she explained to me, well, it's not great because he's just been sleeping on the streets of Gallup because, we haven't had any water at the house until the water truck came. So no water meant no tamales, and no tamales meant no gas money, and no gas money meant I couldn't go get my husband, and my husband hasn't been working for 20 days, and that means we've had no income. And so that lack of access to water meant that her family was on like the brink of an economic reality that they had never experienced before. She's like, we've coped our whole lives, but I've never been in this place where there is truly nothing. There's no water, there's no money, I can't make anything work. And so that is in a nutshell. There are many stories like that littered throughout the report so that someone can sort of get an idea of what the economics of this look like in someone's lived reality. Something that, on the ground practitioners see all the time and try to catalog, but maybe don't always put next to the data. But that's when I'm talking about like sort of coping strategies, that's what that looks like.
And the ripple effect is a little bit like a avalanche, right? It builds on each other, and one thing turns into another, turns into sleeping on the streets of Gallup. So I think that's a powerful way to position it. So the next slide gives us this number. $15,800 per year is what it costs each household. What's within that number? Can you unpack what makes up that 15,000 to help us understand how we did the math behind the inside baseball of the math?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the first thing to note is that is much more money than many of the families that we serve make in a given year. And that number, almost $16,000 per household, obviously these are the most marginalized families in the country, families without access to basic resources. And so that's money we're sort of taking away from households that, need it the most, basically the communities that need that money in order to develop economically the most. There's no extra wiggle room in those communities. And those impacts are felt by the households first, which is why we do so much work to kind of place this number in context, $16,000 per household, not just this sort of $9 billion number, which may be important to a lawmaker, but feels a little intangible sometimes. And yeah, it's all about those coping mechanisms. So we looked at, okay, if you don't have access to a clean source of running water at home, how does that impact you? What do? You probably have to, first of all, you wake up every morning thinking about it. Causes depression, causes anxiety. It has these mental health impacts that are creating a need for hospitalization, medication, suicidal ideation. We understand the healthcare impacts of those mental health outcomes on the U.S. economy. So let's measure those. And then we understand that these families that we work with have to find water somewhere. If they're lucky, they get to buy it at the store. We can estimate what that gas and, vehicle breakdown cost is. We can estimate what the cost of bottled water might look like per family on sort of a price per gallon average. But we know that if they can't get it and a certain portion can't or don't, like Crystal was talking earlier, a lot of people don't know. They have access to a mine shaft or a mountain spring or a livestock trough, and they use that, and they don't know they're becoming sick with nitrates or with arsenic or with uranium. And so those waterborne illnesses or those chemical or mineral illnesses create hospitalizations. We can track all of that data too. We have good data on those things in the U.S., which is really helpful. It's more difficult to track those things in Kenya and Zimbabwe than it is in the U.S. Other coping mechanisms. If you're gonna haul water, you're probably gonna have less time at work. You're probably gonna have less time at school. And then, you get into the really wonky things. So what economists call knock-on impacts, the idea that, if you take a potential dollar out of the economy, that dollar is not generating more dollars by being spent in a local grocery store or a gas station or being tithed at church. And so every dollar you take out of a local economy isn't really just $1. It's $1 plus all of the additional economic impacts that dollar could create over a given amount of time. And for our time scale, we looked at 50 years.
That's great. Knowing that we're often conservative in what we want to present out to the world so it's not torn down immediately, what isn't included in that number? Like what knowing that we pulled out the unhoused populations from the numbers that we were working with, what other things got pulled out when we came up with these dollar amounts?
Which, by the way, still kind of guts me. I think, like...
It's a whole different research project, George. There's more to do.
It is a whole different research project. But, you know, the most marginalized of the most marginalized are people experiencing houselessness or homelessness. And I think that, anyway, there were some things that there is some emerging economic data on, but there's not a broad academic consensus on the strength of the data, so we couldn't include it. There's a list of maybe 20 indicators that we came up with, mostly through interviews with economists or practitioners in the field. I think the two that really stick out in my mind are, one, there's the broader impact that dollar has on the economy. And then there's the opportunity cost that a local economy loses because it doesn't have infrastructure. They're two different things. If your town doesn't have infrastructure, it's unlikely to attract tourism. Even if it's a very beautiful place, people might drive through to see something like Shiprock or Monument Valley, but they're not going to stay in your town if there's no running water. Also, difficult to attract industrial expansion. You know, there are lots of opportunities in some of these towns for people to set up agricultural or industrial operations, but they won't because there's a lack of basic infrastructure and they'd be expected to foot that bill. I think for me the most interesting one was the cultural impacts of a lack of access to water and sanitation. This is where there's a lot of emerging data happening, especially in low and middle income countries with indigenous populations. Not so well understood in the US yet, but a lack of water and sanitation access is pushing people away from the places their ancestors lived, and it's pushing them further from cultural practices. Also, climate change is having a really big impact on how people used to collect water or experience sanitation and how they do now. And that makes it more difficult to grow traditional crops, card traditional wool, make traditional beads or other sort of, or collect, you know, native woods or other things people use in their arts practices, for instance. The loss of those cultural practices and that cultural knowledge has a real dollar impact, a multi-generational dollar impact on someone's economy. And those impacts, while they're being better understood, the sort of impacts that are directly attributable to a lack of access to water, those we still need to do more research to find out. But I imagine for a lot of folks, those are pretty massive related to their household income.
So $9 million, $15,800 per household. It's kind of depressing. Economics is the dismal science, according to some. What's the bright side of this? What's the joy? What's the upside or the benefit of investing in this to solve this problem? What is the benefit of closing the water access gap?
You know what? I'm gonna challenge that a little bit, and maybe you can take me to the next slide. I think $9 billion. I mean, it probably feels small to Jeff Bezos, and that is good. Like, I think like this problem that we are gathering as 300 people here to solve is like eminently solvable. There's so many proof points. First of all, the fact that mostly US dollars have solved this for hundreds of millions of people in other countries already. The fact that we already bring running relatively safe water to 99% of the US population. I mean, I am alarmed by the 40 or 50 million people whose systems are not meeting basic drinking water standards, and that number is growing. Affordability is also a crisis, but still, we have done this for a tremendous amount of people. We know how to do it for rural populations. We did it for rural, mostly white populations, and now we can do it for others. But it is this thing where we shifted our mentality in the 90s, well, mid-80s, with economic liberalization, like the Reagan-Thatcher era. Until then, we invested massive amounts of federal money in the system that delivers our water today, and we sort of agreed as a country that is good. You know, that is like worth doing, even if there's no economic return, even if we don't understand the economics of it. And the argument was made that like, hey, this will eliminate cholera, it'll eliminate typhoid, it'll make people healthier and happier. We had this idea that like it'll help agricultural communities transition into industrial economies, it'll build wealth in the center of the country. We didn't know exactly how that was gonna look, but it worked. I mean, our GDP skyrocketed. We were not, you know, one of the wealthiest countries in the world in the middle of the last century. You know, we weren't even in the top 10. And, you know, post-World War II, after these investments started to get made through the war on poverty and other things, like this infrastructure is what helped us become the richest democracy on earth. And then at some point, we decided like, okay, well, we're at like 95, 96% penetration. Now let's let the free market get us that last 5% of the way. And you know, it did get us a certain number of those percentage points we did get from the free market. Others we got from continuing federal investment, but now we see that that last mile isn't going to be served by that system, and now we're backsliding. So the free market doesn't offer enough protections. And we didn't talk about including this, but I'm gonna. One of the reasons that this hasn't been solved is because the economists that wrote this report, for instance, would call this a wrong pockets problem. Basically, we know that giving people access to water and sanitation creates an economic benefit, but that economic benefit does not accrue to, not enough of it accrues to a single party. So there's no one party that's incentivized enough to build the infrastructure. Does that make sense? So the idea is like, theoretically, if I spend $1 on something and get $2 back in the economy, it's worth doing. But if I'm the person that spends the $1 and only 25% of that money comes back to me and the other 75 cents are spread around the private sector and some goes back to government and some, you know, reduces health costs or whatever, I'm not gonna spend the $1 and only get 25 cents back. So you have to find the actor that either A, gets enough of an economic return to make the investment, or there's another reason that they might make the investment. In the US, there's only one actor that gets a return on this investment at scale, and that's the federal government. So even states, local governments, certainly under-resourced communities, they're never going to be economically incentivized. The research proves it. They'll never be economically incentivized enough to do this on their own. They might do it for other reasons, their own health, their own happiness. But you know, telling them that like this is a way they can build wealth is probably not true in at least the first generation that would invest in these kind of programs. This slide is really important because this is basically how the math broke down. So I'll take you through it. The biggest out of order is on the far right. That's what, those are additional impacts to GDP. That's what we call those knock-on impacts. The idea that if $1 is not in the local economy, it's not getting spent elsewhere, it's not growing, it's not building wealth. The second biggest is time lost, tens of millions of work hours lost, so economic productivity, which we can measure per person. But more concerningly, tens of millions of hours of school or education time lost. That's really difficult. One of the things we didn't include in the math were generational impacts around education. We included one generation of impacts, but we know that educational impacts have knock-on impacts for generations too. So if you don't graduate high school because you were busy collecting water and you couldn't pass or you couldn't attend or whatever, your kids, their kids, and their kids are less likely to achieve educational attainment levels above you. And so it traps your community or your family in a persistent cycle of generational poverty. Then we have $800 million in physical health costs. This is about 215,000 cases of waterborne illness every year. That's just the slice of waterborne illnesses attributable to the water gap in the US. And this includes things like the illnesses in dirty water. It also includes health outcomes that you might not expect, like 36,000 new cases of type 2 diabetes every year because people have easier access to sugar-sweetened beverages than water, or those are more marketed, or they have a single $1 and they go to the store and they think like, well, am I gonna spend my $1 on a bottle of water or on a bottle of Coke? It seems like Coke has more in it, it's more valuable, so I'm gonna spend my $1 on that. Finally, those mental health costs we talked about earlier, again, these are just hard costs. So it's hard to quantify like the impact that anxiety and depression has on someone's personal economic output. These are just like hospitalizations, medications, and therapies.
And I think we heard from every speaker this morning about the mental health costs, right? And that is very real and only getting worse, I think, as time goes on. So I'm going to go to the next slide.
The good news.
The good news, because I'm feeling a little down. So yeah, help us unpack this 5-to-1 return. What does that mean? What does that look like? How does that impact people like this in the photo, or the families that we talk to?
Well, traditionally in an economic impact study, if you're gonna try to measure negative impacts and their dollar amount, basically you know that by reversing a negative impact, you're going to get a reverse dollar amount. You're gonna basically keep those dollars in the economy, and in some cases, like for GDP, by keeping those dollars in the economy, you're gonna grow the economy by providing more money to make money. I mean, welcome to capitalism. So the idea here is that by reversing this, we get $5 in returns. So over, again, a 50-year time period, you have to put sort of a time amount on that so that you know how big to allow your GDP to grow. The average estimate for, we used 50 years because the average estimate of the lifespan for a decentralized system is conservatively about 50 years. Those are a lot shorter in lifespan than a centralized system, and most of the work is centralized. Some of the stuff we won't get into in the presentation, but is deeper in the report, is we had to, in order to get to this number, we had to estimate, okay, how many of the households in the US that don't have access to water and sanitation services can be served by centralized systems versus decentralized systems, because they have a different cost and they have a different return on investment. We did that by essentially estimating their distance from existing water and sanitation systems, which allowed us to estimate how likely they were to be hooked into systems as they came online, how likely they were to be consolidated or enter into systems in nearby municipalities, or how likely it was that someone would have to develop an off-grid solution. So this is about $3 in this is about $2 in direct impact and $3 in indirect economic impact. So for every dollar you invest, you get at least $2 back in real dollars, and then you get at least $3 back in all of those other things we talked about, money that flows back into the economy through lowering medical bills, through increasing educational attainment, the kind of stuff you don't see directly as dollars right away, but that generates economic value for the economy over a period of time. This was not a number that we were sure would be positive when we started the report. So the idea was, we're gonna quantify how much money this is losing the economy every year. We're gonna quantify what that does to a household. We're gonna try to get this number, but we're gonna do it really carefully, because if the number is the inverse of this, if for every dollar we invest, we only get half a dollar back, we're gonna stop that line of inquiry, and we're not gonna include that in the report that we're gonna send to lawmakers. I think that, it was a swing to try to get to this number. I'm really glad it turned out the way it did. It's been a very persuasive argument. It really it's these two twin arguments. One, like, this number is completely solvable, and oh, by the way, if we solve it, everyone gets richer. Great, we love that kind of argument. But it wasn't necessarily that way, and so a lot of thought had to go into the progression of the research design, so that if we got an answer to this question that we didn't like, the whole project wouldn't be doomed.
Always planning for worst case, as a true economist would. So I'm going to skip to this slide, because this all is going to take time. I think we've heard there's no silver bullet. There's no flipping a switch to solve this crisis, even in this very wealthy place that we live. And but for every year that we chip away at the problem, I think cumulatively, one of the findings was this is the number. This is a big number. And again, I think what this report does really well is it has some really big staggering numbers, and it also then drills down to, what does that mean? Because $9 billion 200 billion over 50 years. That's really hard to wrap your head around and wrap your arms around. And so it drills down and then also has these big, very striking numbers that you can kind of drop at a cocktail party and shock someone and really get their attention and then really drill down to what it means. So do we want to skip past this and talk about what has changed? We released this in June of 2022, so we're now coming on 2 years of this report having been released. What has shifted? What progress might we have seen? Let's jump to that in terms of what next and what's happened in the last 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, a lot has happened in the last 2 years. This is a big movement forward. Just gathering as a sector and pushing some of these other research projects forward and getting better data from communities. I think, actually, maybe I'll ask all of you that too. I'll offer some of my thoughts, but if you have anything to add, I'd be curious. Some of the big things that I've been tracking in terms of, macro level changes in the water and wastewater sector that are probably going to have economic impacts. Obviously, the biggest one is this massive amount of federal money that's coming online. But I will say that I don't see a very concerted and certainly not an effort with any hope of success to measure the economic impact of that investment, or really even if that investment's making it into communities and if it's getting properly used. I think there are certain agencies, IHS among them, that are doing that well because they have better data to track against. Like, I said it on stage yesterday, but the IHS Sanitation Facilities Efficiency List is this clear checklist where we can invest, see an outcome, know if the investment made it to where that outcome is, and then give researchers the opportunity to track, because we have such a good list, what the public health and economic benefits of that outcome are. That is not true for the way most of that EPA and USDA, primarily EPA funding, is flowing through SRFs in the rest of the country. And by the way, a lot of it's not flowing because there weren't shovel-ready projects to take up that money, and it's time-bound, and so there's a lot of questions around that. I think the other big economic impact factor that we're seeing that was just starting to ramp up, not even to peak or to crest when we released this data, was inflation. The inflationary environment and the Fed borrowing environment of the last 2 years have had major impacts on these families, not because they're borrowing money themselves for mortgages or other things, but because they're at the bottom often of that food chain or at the end of that food chain. And so they're often reliant, especially in rural areas, on goods and services, and being further from manufacturing bases, those things get more expensive, especially with the inflationary costs around transportation and fuel, which have been the highest in the US economy. And then finally, there's some good stuff, like some hope. I think Virginia followed California in enshrining a human right to water in their state constitution over the last couple years. That, we know from California's experience, creates a really positive regulatory environment where there's the development of all sorts of new research and often funding programs that are based on really a sort of cultural premise that you can enshrine in law, because those laws don't have any teeth themselves. All they do is get everyone to agree that, like, this is an injustice and we need to do something about it, and you'd be surprised by how powerful just like saying that in law can be. My colleague Alexandra Campbell-Ferrari from CWSC, who's doing the law thing upstairs, she would completely disagree with me. She would say, like, that law's worthless, doesn't have any teeth, like, but she's a litigator. I am a social scientist, so like I think it's great. Yeah, I think those are some of the big things that I've seen change. I don't know, what other economic impacts or things that could be impacting economics are you all seeing, are you? I'll say too that like that $15,800 that you see an impact, that happens immediately if you get shut off. Like those numbers are the same. if you're still living in a household without access to water, you immediately have to drop into all those coping mechanisms. And so this math works for shutoffs too.
Yeah, and we've got a partner that DigDeep works with in the Eastern Coachella Valley, and I would say that that point about the California having recognized human right to water, I say, oh well, you can do this because you can tap into those funds that are available in California because California's recognized the human right to water, and not that it wouldn't his model would work in other places, but it's just that much more powerful because he has those state funds that he can tap into for his work because of that legal. So teeth or no teeth is debatable, but I do think that it creates the space for those types of funding opportunities. And Alexandra and her partner also did a study, Rachel, that you can tap into about shutoffs and who gets notified when, how much time you get notified if you are behind on payments, or if it just gets shut off. So, I mean, that affordability piece is really another place we could go next with research and explore. We have lots of opportunities.